Hi, I'm Megan. Welcome to today's live reading of The Shadowbringer by Brandi Elledge, presented by Itty Bitty Book Bits. Join me. Chapter 1. I stood in my nice flats and itchy dress that my mother had bought me last Christmas and tried not to sigh for a third time. My mother hated nothing worse than a repeat offender. Every first Sunday of the month, our town held a community meeting for kids ages 10 and up that was led by the peer ministry staff, and no one wanted to talk about how their abbreviation was PMS. As I sat there under a hot tent, baking from the heat like a pig in a blanket, I realized that maybe their name was intentional. Irritability, bloating, fatigue. Don't have those symptoms? Well, come to a PMS meeting and you'll leave with that, at least two of the three. I chuckled to myself. My mom gave me a look from the corner of her eye. That was a warning. After that, she would pinch me. Parents were invited, but it wasn't mandatory for them. My mother always came with me though, just to ensure I actually showed up. I gave a few fake smiles as I passed other people from the community. We all pretended that it was our choice to gather. My mother ushered us to some hard chairs in the back. God love her. I wasn't the only one who liked to make a quick escape at the end of these meetings. Though, to be fair, I think she liked to leave promptly because she had a hard time hiding her crazy. Typically, they lasted for an hour, but if one of the staff was on a rampage, then it would waste a perfectly good Sunday. The meetings were all the same. Are we doing our part in the community? Are our lawns cut exactly 1 inch from the soil? Have we witnessed any strange behavior? Occasionally, the host of the meeting would venture off about making sure we kept our community safe from the impure. The vinyl seating stuck to the back of my thighs, and it was at that moment that I knew I was in hell. I bit back another sigh as I fanned my dress out around my knees. I didn't know why mother always insisted I dress up for these things. Something about keeping up appearances, and it's what my father would have wanted. But who was I trying to keep up with was beyond me. Mr. Hoover, the mayor of our community, took the makeshift stage. He did that weird thing where he made eye contact with as many of us as he could, all 360 of us. This was going to be one of those wasted Sundays. I could just sense it. He cleared his throat. A refresher course seems to be in need for our young teens who are in the audience this morning. Seriously? When will we not at these stupid meetings? Heaven forbid we miss one. And then someone from the committee would show up at our door with a fake smile and a cake, asking questions about our well-being. Missing meetings looked suspicious. It meant that we might not be as serious about protecting our community as they want us to be. A group of teenagers was caught trying to leave the community the other night. There were collective gasps. Mr. Hoover nodded. They have been sternly dealt with, but we still need to have a discussion so that others can learn from their mistake. The first time you break a rule, it's a warning. There is no second time, as Commander Carver will exile you from the community. And parents, lest you forget, it is a cruel world out there. He moved to stand in front of a small boy squatting down so they were eye to eye. This was the part where he would try to terrorize the child, hoping you'd put enough fear in him to last a lifetime. The world has 3 different types of beings in them: the pure, aka mortals, or mortals who haven't turned yet, impure, and shadowbringers. I rolled my eyes. The heat was causing me to have boob sweat, and the itchy dress was clinging to me like saran wrap. And because Mr. Hoover loved the sound of his own voice, we were going to be here for a while. Anyway, he continued, giving the child his full attention, some pure have something in them waiting, just waiting to be mutated. Once you mutate, you become impure and have a chance of becoming more than just an abomination. You could be a shadowbringer. A few old ladies in the front tisked at the mention of the forbidden shadowbringers. I groaned, and in return, my mom lightly pinched me. I moved in my seat, making the vinyl cover squeak inappropriately. I always got the giggles at the worst time possible, and I did so now, until Mr. Hoover's eyes met mine with disdain before he turned his attention once again to the front row, where he nodded sympathetically to the old ladies. I know, but luckily we've never had any shadowbringers in our community, and the reason for that is we don't let the impure fully mutate in our town. I'm sure after the impure fully mutates, they become one of those creatures. I snorted, causing Mr. Hoover's beady eyes to swing my way again. Something funny, Riley? I could feel my mom's crazy-eyed stare. No, sir. I was just thinking, couldn't some of us be impure? So aren't your words borderline insulting? My mom groaned. Yes, but if you are here in this community, then you will never fully mutate if you're impure, will you? If you carry the gene and it rears its ugly head, then you will continue to be safe in our community, and others will continue to be safe from you. Mr. Hoover walked down the makeshift stage and then knelt in front of another poor kid who was maybe 7 or 8. The fully mutated and pure are dangerous because they want to harm the pure, but we do not need to fear them as long as we do what, Tenny? The little boy looked at his mom, who gave him a nod. Then he looked back at Mr. Hoover and said, as long as we stay inside the fence and we follow the rules, we will be okay. Mr. Hoover laid a hand on the boy's shoulder and gave it a squeeze of false sincerity. Let's take a second and talk about what is out there. Some impure have mutated to the point where they crave others' blood. We call these abominations vampires. Some impure shift into wolves or different animals, and some can cast a spell quicker than you can blink. The only safe place is our community, along with some other pure communities set up around the states. What makes our community so safe? Not willing to share the spotlight, he rushed on before anyone could answer his question. I'll tell you what, we have a barrier made of steel, silver, and crosses that won't allow the vampires, someone hissed, or the wolves in. Even though the mutation is genetic, not all parents will hand down the mutation to their children. Sometimes it skips a generation. He wiped a hand along his sweaty brow and gave a nervous chuckle. Only time will tell if you're going to mutate. Regardless, we have a cure for the ones who carry the impure gene. Ms. Irene sat in the middle row with her sister's children spread around her like baby ducks. As if she didn't think Mr. Hoover was doing a good enough job, she spoke up. It's like an alcoholic. If you don't know you're an alcoholic, unless you have your first taste of liquor, it's best to stay away from the stuff. If you have the impure gene, then you have to do whatever it takes to stop yourself from mutating. She held up a pair of manacles she wore on her wrist. It's not your fault if you carry the gene, but it is your fault if you don't stop the mutation with everything you got. That's why Auntie Irene wears these, for your safety. Mr. Hoover cleared his throat, clearly agitated that someone took the spotlight. We got lucky when we came across a witch with a conscience. She had a daughter who hasn't shown signs of the mutated gene yet. Her daughter is in this community, a pure, as of right now. A ton of heads swiveled to where I assumed Muraki was seated. I stifled a laugh as Muraki cut her eyes toward Mr. Hoover. I would bet with everything I owned that if Muraki were a witch, Mr. Hoover would be her first target. I actually pay for front row tickets to that event. She scanned the crowd as if to let everyone know that she had nothing but disdain for them, pure or not. When her eyes landed on me, I gave her a wink, causing her lips to twitch. She had once been beaten by Commander Carver because she told everyone who would listen that her mother had been forced to put a protective spell around the community and that she was stolen to make sure her mother kept the barrier up. I actually believed her wild story. Commander Carver was sadistic. Mr. Hoover might like to pretend that he ran the show, but he took orders from the commander, and I was almost certain that Commander Carver's strings were being pulled by someone else. Over the course of the years, I had always invited Mariki to sit at our table at school, but she'd always declined. Part of me thought it was because she was a loner, and the other part of me thought it was because she was praying that when she turned 18, she would mutate into a witch and burn this place to the ground. She didn't want to have to worry about friends. Either way, I couldn't fault her. Many a time I wish I had the power to lay waste to this place. Anyway, Mr. Hoover continued, in exchange for a safe haven for her daughter, she put a casting spell on the outside of our community. It will not allow vampires, werewolves, or witches through our gates. We are protected here. Tenny raised his hand. Ugh. He was too young to realize that if he asked questions, we would literally be here all day. No one loved the sound of their voice more than Mr. Hoover. Well, except for Commander Carver. Yes, Tenny. What about the shadowbringers, and what do they do? We don't need to worry about them, Tenny. They are terrified of salt, so we have trenches dug around our fences that are filled with the mineral. They can't cross into safe haven. As for your second question, we don't know exactly what a shadowbringer is. I've heard stories that they eat humans for breakfast, but I hope that cannibalistic rumors are just that, rumors. Their title alone doesn't sound promising, though. The boy's face turned pale, and his mother wrapped a comforting arm around him. As if sensing his bad joke and faux pas, Mr. Hoover straightened and quickly returned to the makeshift stage. I tell all of you this not to frighten you, but to remind you all of why we're here, why this community is important. This community is for all of you so that you can have a future without fear, but we need to remember why we must follow the rules and why we must stay inside of this community. Commander Carver was a tyrant, and I knew that because while he was visiting another Puritan community, everyone breathed easier. He wasn't just tough on outsiders, he was tough on his community. Mr. Hoover wanted to be just like his idol, Commander Carver, obviously. They were both douches, but Mr. Hoover was more like a greasy car salesman scheming to vocalize his agenda, whereas Commander Carver was rotten to the core. Someone tell me our rules. Mr. Hoover pointed to Stacy, and the way her mother and father clenched their jaws and shot daggers at her, I could only assume she was one of the kids who had tried to sneak out. Stacy, I think you need to go over the rules, so why don't you cite them for us? She looked at her parents nervously before she said, we stay inside the community to be with her mother whispered, like-minded people. Yeah, that means we all think alike, Stacy said with an eye roll. We might all have the gene that makes us impure, so we have to agree when we are 18 to be watched, and if we mutate, then we have to take the cure. Correct, Stacy. Around your 18th birthday, you will mutate if you have the faulty gene. If you do carry it and are impure, then you must undergo a sterilization process. It's cruel, I know, but this way you won't reproduce. It's the pure way of making sure the disease will not continue to spread. You must also wear manacles to wipe away any powers that you might have to make others feel safe, and of course have a tracker installed. Here in Safe Haven, we don't want to force anyone out of the community, but each of you will have to earn your place. Mr. Hoover put a hand in his pocket and started to pace in front of all of us. Honestly, it was probably the most exercise the man had gotten since the last meeting. And why should we never leave the community? Jacob, a 13-year-old, raised his hand and Mr. Hoover called on him. Jacob's voice squeaked as he was on the cusp of puberty. Others out there have mutated, are running around harming themselves, other impure and pure. Mr. Hoover nodded. And the extremists are hunting down the impure that don't comply, so if we don't want to get into the crosshairs, this is the best place for us. Mr. Hoover nodded his approval, and a smile lifted his chubby cheeks until he scanned the crowd and saw me. I sighed deeply. My facial expressions were going to be the death of me. I was not entirely sure what vibe I was giving off, but I knew that Mr. Hoover didn't agree with whatever my face was screaming at him. Are we boring you, Riley? Abso-freaking-lutely. Mom started mumbling something under her breath. Not at all. When he just looked at me expectantly, I said, it's just that we all know the rules. They are reiterated to us once a month, so I'm not bored, sir. I'm just extremely well informed. Oh, is that right? He said condescendingly, because Stacy here tried to leave the community. Stacy's voice wobbled. I didn't try to leave the community. I just went to the border. Mr. Hoover had spittle flying as he shouted, You were over the salt trenches. What if a shadowbringer got you? Then she wouldn't be sitting here in this god-awful meeting. In my humble opinion, it would have been a quick and merciful death. Mr. Hoover straightened his tie and ran a hand over his slicked back hair as he tried to regain composure. This isn't a joke. If you want to know what it is outside this community, then by all means go, but you will not be allowed back in when you find out you've made the biggest mistake of your life. He put on a fake smile for Tenny. The mutated gene can only be activated after puberty and before the age of 25 to be successful because, for whatever reason, those who mutate later in life don't survive. Their hearts give out and they go into cardiac arrest, causing instant death. With that being said, there is roughly 14 years or so that you can become one of those abominations, a fully mutated impure. Tenny was trying to crawl into his mom's lap, but if Mr. Hoover knew that he was scaring the child, he didn't care. Man, I hated him. If I ever mutated into an abomination that had supernatural powers, he would need to run from me. Mr. Hoover clapped his hands loudly, forcing me out of my dark thoughts. A parent's worst nightmare is to lose a child, and that is a huge possibility if they mutate and don't agree to the community's terms. Mr. Hoover sighed. So parents, talk to your children. Make sure they understand why it is important to follow all of our requirements and not venture outside of this community to associate with the impure or worse, end up dead by their vile hands. Mrs. Betty, who was older than dirt and always smelled of sickly perfume, said loudly, I can't understand why they would even think about sneaking out of the community. It makes no sense. Hear, hear, Mr. Hoover said. I understand exactly where you are coming from, Mrs. Betty. Unfortunately, kids are inquisitive and more courageous than they should be, and that is why, as adults, we need to protect them. Mrs. Betty nodded, and I twitched in my seat. This whole meeting was a joke, just like every monthly meeting. Mr. Hoover talked for another solid 30 minutes, but I tuned him out as I had more important things on my mind. Tomorrow was the first day of my senior year. Sam, my best friend, had so much mischief in her blood that she made me look like a saint. She always managed to miss most of these meetings. She claimed a fake medical diagnosis and somehow got away with it. I suspect that Mr. Hoover knew she was lying, but he was legit scared that she would shout out random curse words during a meeting, so he decided to let Samantha skip out on these horrendous events. Plus, her mother was the dean at our school. I guess they figured that Sam's mom would keep her in line. I mean, they would both be wrong in their assumption because Sam just followed the beat of her own drum and let me be in the band. I had a feeling that this year was going to be different. This year would be my year. When I looked in the mirror, I would no longer see eyes full of regret for a wasted youth, but I'd see a girl with plans. Sam and I had planned on breaking out of this community and traveling after the school year. We just had to bide our time.